I want to talk about faces, and it's going to get emotional. Inability to properly understand and use facial expressions is a well-known trait of autism, and this difficulty in reading emotions from faces has been used to support bad ideas, like the idea that autistic people are unempathetic, cold, or even duplicitous. But what if autistic people aren't the only ones who can't read emotions from facial expressions? What if nobody can, and it's just that we're the only ones self-aware enough to realise it? Keep watching to find out why you're deluding yourself. I'm kidding. Kind of. Not really. What's a face? The Wikipedia page for face is, well, it's really bad. It's incredibly low on citations too, even for a Wikipedia page, so I didn't spend long there. But we all know what a face is though, don't we? It's a collection of features on the front of your head, fleshy bumps and holes that do important things, including famously expressing our emotions. You've got lots of muscles and nerves that react to things subconsciously. The way they look is largely based on genetics, and the way they are perceived is largely based on culture. They're weird little things, really. Us autistics are known for having what is called a flat affect, which means we aren't as overly expressive as others might be. And you've got other people who are extremely expressive, who live their lives on perpetual kindergarten teacher mode. Like Americans. That's a joke. Hashtag not all Americans. Where are my introverted Americans at? What's that? You're not there? You can't afford Wi-Fi because you can't get a decent job because the recruitment AIs won't let you pass the personality tests. Sorry. Speaking of, you know, reading emotions is the next thing they're trying to get AI to do. It's not going great. Of course, you see the same problems facing all facial recognition software. It's racist as fuck. But there might be another problem with the very idea that software could ever accurately read emotions. But that obviously isn't stopping tech companies or law enforcement from spending tons of money on these programs, including, but not limited to, AI that tries to read your emotional responses to watching an advert to see how likely you are to watch adverts of that kind. Market researchers, please get out of my house. But hey, could a program ever read emotions from faces? Could you? Well, traditional views of faces and emotions would say that yes, certainly you can. Of course you bloody can. Smile, happy, frown, sad. Oh my god, right, I have to talk about this just quickly, right? You might have noticed that I'm British, right? But most of my audience is from the States. And I recently learned that, at least to some of you, a frown is something you do with your mouth. At least according to Twitter anyway. Like, this is a lifelike illustration of a sad American. You see, in Britland, we think of a frown as being this bit. Yeah. That is a pout, surely. But then you're all gonna be like, well, what did you think we meant by turn that frown upside down? I obviously thought it was a metaphor, you literal weirdos. I come from the land of Shakespeare. We have those there. But that's really interesting though, isn't it? Depending on the person you're talking to, if you told them to frown, they might pull very different faces. And that's interesting, isn't it? Like, for example, in the West, we usually associate wide-eyed expressions with fear or shock. Whereas in other cultures, including Maori culture, a wide-eyed expression is more commonly associated with aggression or anger. And it's not like we don't go wide-eyed when we're angry or aggressive. If you're shouting at someone, you're likely going to have a wide-eyed expression. Aren't you? Now, while we certainly do use our faces to communicate our emotions, the way we do that is far more interesting than just smile happy, frown sad. But the idea that, no, actually, it is that simple, that facial expressions do have certain intrinsic and inherent meanings that adhere to specific emotions, that's a pretty old idea. The seminal work on the meaning of facial expressions comes from evolution daddy himself. Oh, Charlie Dar. Our friend Chazza D, naturalist, biologist, and tortoise botherer himself, Charles Darwin. While Darwin's famous theory of evolution has since been accepted and built upon, his theories about facial expressions are rather less sound. Victorian times, innit? In the third part of the evolution theory trilogy, The Expression of Emotion in Man and Animals, Darwin studied a series of common emotions and how they are expressed in both man and animals. He studied a wide variety of common emotions by analysing data by zoologists, imperialist colonizers, and owners of insane asylums, so methodology could use some work. It's worth noting that before Darwin, it was commonly thought that only humans felt the kind of affect that produces emotions, and that this was evidence that we had been bestowed upon with God-given attributes. In essence, Darwin concluded that the emotions that he studied are universal. That means that no matter where you go in the world, you'll see the same expressions for emotions. You'll see the same faces being made for the same reasons. These inbuilt, essential expressions for emotion, he said, are grounded in genetics and survival. And when he said grounded in genetics, he means it. He posits that expressions can be inherited through bloodlines as well as learned in later life.
Englishmen are much less demonstrative than the men of most other European nations, and they shrug their shoulders far less frequently and energetically than Frenchmen or Italians do. I have never seen very young English children shrug their shoulders, but the following case was observed with care by a medical professor and excellent observer. The father of this gentleman was a Parisian, and his mother a Scotch lady. His children have been reared in England, and the nursemaid is a thorough Englishwoman who has never been seen to shrug her shoulders. Now his eldest daughter was observed to shrug her shoulders at the age of between 16 and 18 months. The father is told that he sometimes shrugs his shoulders, especially when arguing with anyone. But it is extremely improbable that his daughter should have imitated him at so early an age, for, as he remarks, she could not possibly have often seen this gesture in him. This little girl, it may be added, resembles her Parisian grandfather in countenance to an almost absurd degree. Considering all the circumstances with reference to these children shrugging their shoulders, it can hardly be doubted that they have inherited the habit from their French progenitors, although they have only 1/4 French blood in their veins.
Oh, Chazza is saying here that because this girl had never seen people shrug her shoulders, which is a bold claim to make, let's be honest, that this means that she must have inherited the expression from her French grandfather, even though he wasn't really a shoulder shrugger himself, because Darwin observed that the French love a good shrug. So it's probably that drop of French blood what made her like that. You can see that while Darwin's work did move Western societies a step away from certain harmful and essentialist ideas based on religious teachings, it was a small step, and his ideas have been widely used to support all kinds of eugenicist, racist, and imperialist endeavours. In fact, while Darwin might have argued that the barbarous races were technically human like us, he also wholeheartedly supported the idea that they must be civilised by invading forces, and that to do so would be an act of kindness, an advancement of humanity. People can be right about some stuff and wrong about other stuff. You heard it here first. He also frequently compares the insane, cretins, idiots and imbeciles, and of course the barbarous races with lower animals, writing some pretty out there stuff about how people who have been incarcerated in asylums tend to have messy hair, and what could that mean?
Dr. Brown further remarks that the bristling of the hair, which is so common in the insane, is not always associated with terror. It is perhaps most frequently seen in chronic maniacs who rave incoherently and have destructive impulses. But it is during their paroxysms of violence that the bristling is most observable. The fact of the hair becoming erect under the influence both of rage and fear agrees perfectly with what we have seen in the lower animals.
But in the end, this idea of universal expressions for emotions took off in a big way, and it became the way of thinking about facial expressions for, well, forever. In fact, maybe a lot of you out there think of facial expressions in this way. After all, how can autistic people be bad at reading the emotions from faces if there's no right way to do it? But it wasn't just like everyone went, well, if Darwin says so, then I guess that's that. Obviously, I'm clearly French. No. In fact, people criticised the idea over the years. People like anthropologist Margaret Mead, who supported the idea that facial expressions were cultural, not universal. But then in came Paul Ekman. Is it giving Kaelin Conrad? Not quite, right? Widely known as the man who discovered micro-expressions, Paul Ekman was an American psychologist who set out to prove Darwin right once and for all with science and flashcards. And with, as it happens, a nice big grant by none other than DARPA. That's the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. Put a pin in that one. Actually, put a big red flag in that one. So what he did was he went around the world and he showed people pictures of faces and he asked them to choose the emotion from a short multiple choice list. In other tests, his researchers showed photos of faces alongside a short story. So for example, her mother died and she is very sad. And then they had to pick the face, again out of a short multiple choice list. In Western or Westernized countries, subjects chose the correct face or word about 85% of the time. Elsewhere, such as in China, Malaysia, Ethiopia and Turkey, subjects responded as expected 72% of the time. Ekman and his team then travelled to Papua New Guinea to an uncontacted community to see if they would produce the same results. These uncontacted people should be free from outside cultural influence, and so if they could guess the faces, then that would prove that the faces are universal. And guess what? They did. Case closed. Darwin confirmed. Over the coming years, other teams of researchers replicated his methodology exactly and found similar results. And this made the people over at DARPA very happy, I'm sure. Ekman's work was of great interest to any and all law enforcement agency. Anyone who might have some kind of interest in being able to quickly and efficiently profile people in the name of security. They all love to see it. And since then, Ekman has been very busy developing systems, running training, and basically writing the book on deception detection techniques, all of which are used fondly by people like border control guys and Secret Service dudes, and those fellas down at the CIA. If you want to learn more about Ekman and lie detection and all the dystopian nonsense that goes along with it, I recommend Mooncat's video called I Debunked Every Body Language Expert on YouTube. She has a whole chapter properly diving into Ekman and the consequences of his research, as well as the title might suggest, tearing apart the entire idea of body language experts. It's very good and hilarious. But while law enforcement was busy adopting systems based on Ekman's findings, His findings were being debunked all over the scientific field. Researchers had started to notice the glaring problem with Ekman's methodology, mainly that he was priming his subjects, giving them a narrow multiple choice or priming them on the context of the situation, basically setting them up for success. Her mum just died. What face is it? So other researchers didn't do that. They ran similar experiments but left the answers open. Here's a face, tell us what emotion it is. No, we're not going to give you a list of 6 English words to pick from, just tell us, you know, science. One of those researchers was Lisa Feldman Barrett, professor of psychology and affective neuroscience. When her team ran those tests, Western subjects guessed the correct emotion only 58% of the time, down from 85%. And things only got worse when they changed the question to remove all mention of emotion. So like, tell us what is going on inside that person. Because when you hear the word emotion, you get a short list of emotional concepts in your head. And things got worse still. Next, Feldman's team just presented 2 photographs of faces placed side by side and asked people, do these people feel the same emotion? And people correctly identified matches only 42% of the time. And it didn't stop. Her team then did a bit of brain hacking on the subjects designed to interfere with the subjects' access to their own emotional concepts. So they had them repeat an emotion word like anger over and over again. Anger, 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 until the word loses all meaning and just becomes a noise. And then they immediately presented them with the faces and asked if they matched. And the success rate dropped to 36%. The next tests they did were with subjects who had permanent brain lesions, which caused them to forget words and concepts, including emotional ones. So those subjects were given photos of faces and they were asked to sort them into piles that were meaningful to them. Now the subjects had been given photographs of 6 emotional concepts, but they only produced 3 piles: positive, negative, and neutral. What's an emotion? You see, this was the question at the heart of Lisa Feldman Barrett's work. She wasn't just out to debunk the Ekman. Understanding the nature of emotions is Feldman Barrett's life's work. She's received many honours and awards and has, frankly, revolutionised the fields of psychology and affective neuroscience. Her theory, the theory of constructed emotion, is a robust explanation of what emotions actually are. Her journey began at grad school, where she tried to determine the roots of low self-esteem and how it relates to anxiety and depression. So she asked subjects to identify whether they felt anxious or depressed at different times. And she straight away hit a wall. Subjects couldn't do it. Either they would say that they felt both or neither, but rarely would they pick one. But these should be quite distinct feelings. Anxious is jittery and worked up, and depressed is sluggish and miserable. But Barrett ran these tests 8 times in a row and always got the same results. People are kinda rubbish at identifying their own emotions. People used the same word to mean different things.
We discovered that people vary tremendously in how they differentiate their emotional experiences. A skilled interior designer can look at 5 shades of blue and distinguish azure, cobalt, ultramarine, royal blue, and cayenne. My husband would call them all blue. My students and I had discovered a similar phenomenon for emotions, which I described as emotional granularity.
So Barrett thought that she could simply teach people better emotional granularity and allow them to accurately identify their emotions. But to do that, there would need to be something to accurately identify.
The fingerprint of an emotion is assumed to be similar enough from one instance to the next, and in one person to the next, regardless of age, sex, personality, or culture. In a laboratory, scientists should be able to tell whether someone is sad or happy or anxious just by looking at physical measurements of a person's face, body, and brain.
Let's be clear, Lisa was fully expecting to be able to accurately identify emotions in a lab setting, just as the prevailing theories from Darwin and Ekman predict.
According to the classical view of emotions, our faces hold the key to assessing emotions objectively and accurately. So I thought that my lab should be able to measure facial movements, assess our test subject's true emotional state, and compare it to verbal reports. If subjects made a pouting expression in the lab, for instance, but did not report feeling sad, we could train them to recognize the sadness they must be feeling. Case closed.
But it wasn't case closed. Test after test by Barrett's team and others showed a great variety in the way that people report their own emotions, what faces people pull while they're experiencing emotions, and what goes on physiologically inside their bodies when emotions are triggered.
Where emotions and the automatic nervous system is concerned, 4 significant meta-analyses have been conducted in the last 2 decades, the largest of which covered more than 220 physiology studies and nearly 22,000 test subjects. None of these 4 meta-analyses found consistent and specific emotion fingerprints in the body. Instead, the body's orchestra of internal organs can play many different symphonies during happiness, fear, and the rest. Despite tremendous time and investment, research has not revealed a consistent bodily fingerprint for even a single emotion.
Long story short, but accurately identifying emotions based on physiology or faces seems to be impossible. The thing we're detecting most of the time is affect. So that's your basic feelings: positive, negative, neutral, stimulated, and calm. Affect such as this is present in animals and humans, but affect is not emotion. And confusing it for emotions can have some pretty problematic consequences. Is that feeling in your stomach a sign that you're falling in love with your date, or that you shouldn't have had that pizza for lunch? Are those jitters nerves, or did you just have too much caffeine? Are you sad and frustrated, or are you hungry? Look, I'm not saying that it's impossible to identify your own emotions. I'm saying that when you do that, you do more than analyze your body. We analyse the context, the environment, what's going on with us. For example, nerves and excitement can physically feel pretty similar. They both involve adrenaline, fast heart rate, maybe even jitters. The difference comes from the situation in which those physiological symptoms occur and what that situation means to us as individuals. See, that's the big problem with all behaviourists, isn't it? They ignore the individual. Anyway, the context in which an expression occurs is just as important to understanding the emotion behind it. And we, our brains, put that information together with the socially constructed concepts that we have available to us. Did you know that emotions are social constructs? We love a social construct around here, don't we? Einstein once said,
"Physical concepts are free creations of the human mind and are not, however it may seem, uniquely determined by the outside world."
And we all know that to be a social construct is not to be less real. As Barrett says,
Human civilization was literally built with social reality. Most things in your life are socially constructed: your job, your address, your government and laws, your social status. Wars are waged and neighbor slaughters neighbor, all for the sake of social reality.
the money in your bank, the economic system by which the bank and all the banks operate, all very real, all very consequential, all socially constructed. And emotions are real in the same way. Emotions are concepts, and concepts can differ from culture to culture, or even sometimes from individual to individual. There are cultures around the world who have concepts for emotions that we don't have in the Anglosphere. And Lisa Feldman Barrett has a seemingly rather radical notion about that.
You need an emotion concept in order to experience or perceive the associated emotion. It's a requirement. If you had no concept of sadness, you would not be able to perceive sadness in another person.
But further, she argues that without these emotional concepts, you wouldn't even be able to perceive these emotions in yourself. And that makes sense, because it's due to what is known as experiential blindness. Yeah, we're doing an experiential blindness example because I love them. Look at this. You've got no clue what that is, do you? But your brain is desperately trying to draw from your experiences and the concepts you hold to work it out. And now you won't be able to see anything but that coogie little ladybug. Hello there, ladybug. Your spots are looking splendid this afternoon. Don't know what that was. Or, even cooler, here's an example of how the concepts you are currently holding in your mind will change how you perceive reality. Wild, innit? I sat there for ages with that thing, trying to trick it. Don't work, it's real. Barrett uses some examples to illustrate how culture can influence the emotions that we can perceive. So, for example, the Ilonggot people of the Philippines have an emotion called ligat, which is the intense passion and focus which comes with going to battle or engaging in a hazardous challenge with a group of people, and it involves the togetherness and camaraderie and community of that. It's a positive yet frightening feeling.
It's not just a mental state, but a complex situation with social rules about which activities bring it on, when it is appropriate to feel, and how other people should treat you during an episode.
And consider schadenfreude, which we've now adopted as part of English vernacular. We couldn't properly perceive that emotion until we learned of the concept. At its essence, schadenfreude is pleasure at the misfortune of others, but it's not like a bad thing, you know? Pleasure at the misfortune of others is typically thought to be a negative trait. If somebody took joy in the misery of others as a general rule, we'd probably call that person a bully and bad. But schadenfreude has an underlying meaning, it has more context than that. It's mischievous, it's not serious, it's implied that you know it's mean, it's not very nice. But in this instance of that person's certain misfortune, you get a little kick. In Filipino, there's a word for the urge you get to hug or squeeze something that is unbearably cute. In Japan, there's a word for the feeling you get when you look worse after a haircut. The lines we draw around concepts vary over time and place. To a Russian, dark blue and light blue are two completely different colours, just as blue and green or yellow and orange would be to us. In English, we didn't even have a word for orange for ages. Chaucer described the colour of a fox's tail as betwixt yellow and red. And now we've got greyish, for crying out loud. Just came out of nowhere, suddenly is everywhere. Like colours, emotions exist on a spectrum. And how we carve up spectrums is entirely up to us. You know what else exists on the spectrum? She's finally getting to the autism. Thank you for your patience. Your autism is important to us. All of that was, I hope obviously, to show that it's just not the case that a face does a thing and then from that we're able to tell what a person is feeling, and that autistic people are just deficient in this skill. Emotion detection is a myth. Body language experts are scam artists, and the only way to tell what somebody is feeling is to ask them. Now, at this point, I'm sure some people out there will be thinking, well, hang on, I'm pretty sure I'm quite good at telling how my friends or partner or family members are feeling. Even when they say they're fine, I can tell if they're not. I don't dispute this. But what's going on there is way more than you just looking at their body language and concluding from that. Your brain has access to much more information than that. You know them as individuals. You know their intricacies and tendencies. You know the context in which the emotion is occurring. And remember, being able to tell if somebody is a bit off or in a low mood or in a great mood, that's not really reading emotions, that's noticing affect. People often can ascertain affect, whether somebody is generally in a positive, negative, or neutral mood. But again, not always, and especially not if we're talking about strangers. And you couldn't look at a smile and say that person is proud or is celebrating or feels satisfied or is excited about something, not without context. Think of an example of someone on trial, for example, a crime of passion which they regret. They're not actually a bad person, in fact, they're stoically accepting their fate and guilt, quietly and with poise, holding back from emotional outbursts so as not to make a scene and draw attention from the victim. This could be viewed as remorselessness, as them being insufficiently emotional about their crimes, cold, too confident, calculated. Maybe it wasn't a crime of passion after all. Or think of the testimonies from the jury who watched Amber Heard recount her abuse, saying how she cried too much, looked at the jury too much, remembered too much. Might that same jury have thought that she was being truthful had she remained dry-eyed, avoided their gaze, and couldn't answer questions? It seems to me that no matter how Amber Heard's emotions manifested, it wouldn't have changed the way they were perceived in the minds of the jury or the hundreds of body language experts who crawled out of the woodwork to make a profit from analysing her every movement. Had she been joking around, eating Haribo, drawing pictures, forgetting which country she was in when, forgetting what film she was filming in what year, failing to answer even the simplest question, contradicting herself at literally every turn, and smiling and laughing the whole way through it, would the jury have perceived that in the same way they perceived Johnny Depp when he did all those things? I'm sorry, honestly, don't even get me started on that trial. I am this close to making a video about it. Lie detection is not something that can be done through reading body language. Again, you should really go and watch Mooncat's video because she cites a whole bunch of studies. But it can't. The only way to tell if someone's lying is information gathering. And the same goes for emotions. Now, autistic people, we learn and gather information in a slightly different way to holistic people. Now, it's often said that autistic people think more logically, but honestly, I hate that. I hate it. That kind of talk gives supremacist vibes, if I'm honest. I think what we can say is that autistic people work better with information when it is presented to us or gleaned by us in a certain way. It's often said that autistic people learn things more purposefully than holistic people, who are typically better at learning through osmosis, which is just picking stuff up without being actively aware that you're learning. Autism is a developmental disorder. It's not a neurological or a mental disorder, as way too many people keep saying. In fact, with some of the things that younger autistic people struggle with, they can get better with age. Not everything, of course. But the point I'm trying to make is that to learn things purposefully takes more time. It takes longer to learn things with intent, cognitively, rather than picking things up through perception and sense data. Autistic people often say that it feels like we just weren't given the book of rules that everybody else must surely have received. We do better when expectations are made clear to us, when people communicate directly with us, and when we can communicate directly and be taken at our word. We like things that can be understood by way of rules, systems, and logic, because those things are not very context dependent. Things that work the same way each time are just easier to manage for us. But not everything's like that. Not everything can or should be understood by way of rules. I think we know that. In fact, we typically detest what we see as arbitrary rules. When things get called a rule, but it's clear that the reality of the situation neither requires nor adheres to this rule, that's just confusing. That's not a system that we can learn to understand. If there are too many outliers as to render the rule illogical, then how are we supposed to know when to apply it and when to not? Dislike. That's a big old autistic no thank you. For example, small talk has rules of sorts which autistic people typically struggle with. Honesty is the best policy. Truthfulness is a virtue. Except, of course, when it's not. And it's not a one-way street by any stretch of the imagination. Being autistic is just as much about being misunderstood as it is misunderstanding others. We know that a neutral face doesn't necessarily mean that anything's wrong, because we're constantly being told that we look grumpy when we're not. I used this footage in my video, What is Autism? It's me, receiving a Barbie doll house for Christmas. I had wanted a doll house for forever, and I loved Barbie at that age. I was overjoyed, absolutely overwhelmed with positive emotions, but I was silent and frowning. And my mum was repeatedly asking if I was pleased because she had no way of knowing that I was. My eyes are darting all over the box, taking it all in, my little mouth stimming away to process the excitement, and my brow was furrowed in concentration. I couldn't talk, I was too excited. I was already picturing playing with it, setting up all the little furniture, taking in the smell of the box and the glossy pictures. I can remember it till this day. I was ecstatic. But my mum, who knew me better than anyone else, couldn't tell. In fact, when she filled out a questionnaire for my autism assessment a few years ago, my mum wrote,
"Does not show emotions, good or bad. No real emotions to events including death in the family. She did not appear to understand other people's emotions."
I am an incredibly emotional person. I mean, I had a whole bunch of emotions when I read that. My emotions are as complex and run as deeply as anyone else's. I'm often overwhelmed with emotions, good and bad. But when my mum wrote, "no real emotions," and then also does not understand emotions, that right there displays one of the problems facing autistic people. Here is someone who should have known me, who should have known that just because I didn't immediately burst into tears, that didn't mean I wasn't having emotions. Someone who should have known how to read me, saying that I had trouble recognizing emotions in others, while fundamentally misunderstanding my emotions. My mother describes me as somebody who doesn't understand emotions. A smile can be a sign of happiness, joy, contentment, satisfaction, pride, love. It can also accompany malice, mischief, judgment, anticipation. One can smile or laugh due to nerves, or being uncomfortable, or in surprise or shock. A furrowed brow might be a sign of anger, sadness, contempt, distaste, or focus. Concentration, a headache, a bright light, tension, fear, anxiety, tiredness. Autistic people do have ways of ascertaining the emotions of others. We just can't look at a face and tell what someone's feeling, because that's impossible. And we might also be slow at picking up on contextual cues. So we might need to be told directly what the context is if it's important that we understand quickly. The idea that autistic people simply do not have the usually naturally endowed ability to read the emotions that lie in the faces, this has been used to dehumanize us. It supports very dangerous and wrong assumptions that we're unempathetic, uncaring, unemotional, and don't really have feelings. Dr. Ivar Lovaas, the father of applied behaviour analysis, was a psychologist and professor at UCLA who, after observing behaviourist techniques on animals, decided to try those techniques out on autistic kids, about whom he had this to say.
Autistic children are severely disturbed. People seem to be no more than objects to them. They show no signs of warmth toward others. You see, you start pretty much from scratch when you work with an autistic child. You have a person in the physical sense. They have hair, a nose, and a mouth, but they are not people in the psychological sense. One way to look at the job of helping autistic kids is to see it as a matter of constructing a person. You have the raw materials, but you have to build the person.
The stated goal of Lovaas's work was to train autistic children into acting normal.
Since the emphasis of our treatment program is to make the child look as neat and appropriate as possible, we attempt to suppress the more severe or grotesque forms of self-stimulatory behavior by the use of aversive stimuli.
To do this, he first tried using loud and uncomfortable sounds, trying this technique on 5-year-old autistic twins Mike and Marty. But that didn't work. So he moved swiftly on to just giving them electric shocks. He'd tell them to hug him. If they didn't do it within 3 seconds, they got shocked. And so the boys started giving hugs, and he declared his experiment a success. Well done, science. Lovaas shared his amazing discovery with Richard Green and George A. Reckers, who were interested in whether Lovaas's techniques could be used to fix gay and gender non-conforming children as part of Green's Feminine Boy project. Their joint experiments on 5-year-old Kirk Andrew Murphy were so abusive that Kirk never recovered and died by suicide at 38. Reckers famously went on to found the Family Research Council and was officer and scientific advisor on the National Association for Research and Therapy of Homosexuality. And while Reckers' career ended in disgrace and gay conversion therapy is becoming known for the abuse it is, and is starting to get banned, applied behavior analysis is still seen as an entirely acceptable and medically advised treatment for autism. It's a rapidly growing industry worth around $4 billion per year. The failure of others to understand autistic people has led to our abuse, torture, and death. And yet it is we who are said to have the problems in understanding others. Are we not worth understanding? Are you not curious at all what's going on under that flat affect? We are observed, much like Darwin did to his animals and barbarous peoples. People observe us under different circumstances and make conclusions based on what they perceive. Maybe we just don't do that as much. I don't know, but maybe we don't. Maybe people who know well what it's like to be judged wrongly, maybe they think twice about making assumptions about other people. Maybe if we know, and our experience has always been, that most of the time people are wrong about how we feel, maybe that affects how we approach others. Maybe if you don't know something, you shouldn't just try to guess, but find out. Maybe we should give up on the idea that anyone can fully understand the inner world of another, let alone that best guesses and assumptions are good enough for this. This idea that we don't have to talk to people and believe what they say, that we can ascertain the truth ourselves based on a random assignment of concepts and muscle movements and behaviours. Maybe body language experts should be assigned to the dustbins of history. Maybe we should rip apart the essentialist confines which have been passed down to us for generations. Maybe we need radical empathy, which accepts that you might not ever be able to fully empathise, might never fully understand other people's perspectives, but that you don't need to, that that's fine. You can still treat those you don't understand like humans who deserve your respect and kindness. Okay, so long-term viewers of my channel might be getting a bit of deja vu from this video, and that's because this is actually a remake of my first ever video essay, which was called Face Facts, because it's facts about faces, but also like, you know, it's mind-blowing, you know. You gotta face them facts, man. You can't read the body language, you face facts experts, etc. I did this remake thing because March was my 3-year anniversary on YouTube, and I'm so happy. I can't believe that I get to do something that I actually love for a job, and I just thought this would be a fun way to celebrate. So in that video, I also suggested that we might want to think of some new emotion concept words to describe autistic emotions. Let's create the reality we want to thrive in. I came up with frabbish, right? Frabbish. It's a mix of fabric and rubbish. And it's about when you're feeling extra sensitivity stuff due to the clothes that you're wearing. You know, you have those days, those frabbish days. But you know what I mean, right? Those days when suddenly none of your clothes are comfortable anymore. Those days are frabbish. Anyway, so I asked people in the comments to come up with their own autistic emotion concepts, which is a bold move on your first ever YouTube video. Absolutely 0 subscribers, and I'm asking for audience participation. Got some though, didn't I? So now we're going to have a look at what new concepts we've got available to us. Okay, so Azure came up with stim blocked, the unpleasant sensation experienced when one desperately needs to stim, but one social situation or injury or other factor is presenting them. Got it. Like that. There's no privacy at all. I feel so stim blocked. I like it. I feel the vibes are giving me stim block. Okay, so Rhino Yo-Yo, Autistic Experiential External Validation, aka I've. Or we're going with I've. There's a lot of vowels in that one. The feeling of listening to someone else describe an experience that you low-key thought was unique to you until now due to neurotypical gaslighting. I like that. I'm getting big IE from this conversation. Hello. Bowers contributed overpeopled. I think that one speaks for itself, doesn't it? Love that. Overpeopled. Sorry, I would come, but I'm very overpeopled today. So Emil Greer came up with bloud. So that's when you're trying to listen to something, but the background noise is too loud and it gets louder and louder until you can't hear the thing that you're listening to. Like that. And they also came up with visioid. Visioid? Or when you're looking at something and suddenly it looks as though the object is moving away from you. Visual void. Visioid. Yeah, I get that. That's the thing. That's the thing. When you focus on something and like stuff goes dark, I think that's just a normal thing. When you're having hypersensitive days and you can't block it out, Michael Day came up with frizzly. I'm feeling frizzly. I do enjoy that. I like saying frizzly. That's a good one. That's a good one for hypersensitive days. Sorry, frizzly day. Hilma Prescent contributed sparkle-brained. When you make a logical connection or leap between subjects and it's just so good and you can't stop thinking and talking about it. Yes, I've been thinking about this, right? You can't actually, right, you're not supposed to actually be able to feel your brain activity because there's not sensors in there. But I know exactly what you mean. There is a feeling when something clicks or when you know that you've discovered a new special interest or something's just like suddenly made sense to you about the world or sparkle-brained. Yes. Thank you, Hilma. Danielle Forrest, rearing. The feeling of coming to an abrupt halt because of a change of plans or sense of reality. and not being able to rapidly adjust. Yeah, like when you're all for going to the event or whatever, and you've said yes, and you want to go, but then like it just suddenly hits you that you've got to go, that going to the thing involves going to the thing. I know that sounds silly, but you get me, don't you? I know you get me. I've read a lot of people talking about this and how it causes problems with their relationships, because it's like, you've said you're going to go and you seem fine up until the very last minute, and then it's just like, no, can't. Rearing like a horse. Lots of love in the comments for frabbishness. People vibing with frabbish. Completigue, when you're completely, utterly burned out and sleep deprived, and you desperately need to rest, but you can't because you have to finish this painting / video / game level / chapter of this novel / other task first. Special interests can be tiring. It's true. Completigue. It's a portmanteau of compulsion and fatigue, apparently. Arash often feels sweatlish, which is that ticklish sensation from sweating. Yes, I hate sweating. That's, I can't be expected to exercise. I have sensory needs. Can't be coping with sweatlishness first thing in the morning. Precipane, from I Exist, where you're doing something that involves precision or repetition and you really want to move. Yeah. Yeah, well, I have bad joints, so I get that. If I can't move and I have to like hold my hands still and like do a thing, yeah. Precipane. Precision pain. See, look, there's loads. Scrunch. When you bite into an icy object and it scrapes on your teeth and it's gross. I can't relate to that, actually. I quite like chewing ice. I've led a pretty scrunchless life thus far. Okay, that's it. Someone at the bottom just commented nice hair and then a tongue out emoji. And I know my hair in that video was a right mess. So I think that's a mean comment. You're being mean. One of the automated reply options is, what about it? Okay, so those are the autistic concepts that we have available. Write them down. Get them into circulation. We are coining phrases on this channel now. Language is created with collective intentionality. Let's get some collective intentionality up in here. All right, I think that's enough of that. Okay, boba time.